Thank you very much, Sarah. I want to talk through a project, an EU project that I was involved with, which was looking at non-chemical weed control in 2050. And very interesting because it took away the focus that we have in the UK, where everyone's obsessed with blackgrass, because if you start talking to people in Spain and France, you know, their problems are very different to ours. And we need to think more widely about different solutions for the future. So we already have some solutions available. Many people already using Garford hose with camera guidance systems and intra-row hoeing between that. Case have launched with X-Power this electric weeder which sweeps across the ground, a bit scary in some ways, but you know, new ideas are coming through. But I wanted to start from what we're doing at the moment. So taking it up to 2019, so where we were up to, you know, where we haven't really started farming yet this year too much. At the moment, most people are using chemical control options. They work on a farm scale. We know where we are. We know what our soils are. Those people everyone walks into a field to make their decisions. It's getting harder, as Chloe mentioned, where we've got resistance to think that we have to we have to think about a more diverse range of systems because some of them are failing in that respect. Many people are already subscribing or working out their own site-specific management, so either using drone imagery or satellite imagery or data captured in real time off tractors to say we're going to put more fertiliser here, or we could, but actually taking that down to weed control is much harder because selecting weeds against crop is a much harder deal than just talking about the whole total biomass present, which is predominantly what's happening through site-specific agriculture at the moment. Getting right down to the plant level in broadfield agriculture, that's quite difficult at the moment, and no one's working on the leaf level. But if you take that forward to non-chemical weed control, we've got people on the field scale using mechanical weeding, as we mentioned. We've got site-specific options, so people can go through and do the same scouting, and we need to look at non-chemical ways to get rid of weeds in that respect. At the moment, we do have plant specifics, especially in kind of organic horticultural systems on small scale, where we know it as hand weeding, unfortunately, but obviously we want something a bit more desirable for the workforce than that, and no one's doing anything leaf specific. So taking that through on mechanical weeding, at the moment the most important way to control weeds, as Chloe mentioned, is to have a competitive crop. We need to sow our crop so we know we're not putting it into a compacted soil. We know we're putting it in with a good chance of growing well. It's been very challenging this autumn. And if we want to do inter or intra-row weed control, it's really important that we've got a competitive crop there to start off with that can cover. And row width is really important. So what we tend to find is where people want to go into mechanical weeding, if they want to go in inter-row options, at the moment they tend to go for slightly wider rows so they can get between them. And many people are using drill systems. I mean, this is a particularly big one here, where they work on a linkage system or off a hitch off the tractor. And if you think about these machines when they work, even when they're with auto steer, there's quite a lot of swing and movement in those machines. And that's quite a challenge for the equipment that you're going to run for mechanical weeding, because you get that kind of bouncing and movement going on. And in some ways, changing the way we think about this machine and getting these lines truly straight, because here you can see a slight kink here, makes it much easier to get closer into the row and to make sure that you're not causing crop damage in that respect. And we know that when we get to situations like this, it's really challenging for a camera or even a person to see the difference between weed and row. So weeds, we know, weed harrowing works predominantly by uprooting plants and some slight soil coverage, and it's a really important method of control. And a really important thing to stress, and maybe slightly challenging this year, it works on the difference in establishment between the weed and the crop. And we need the crop to be better anchored than the weed to make sure that we're going to get really good control. And to give the crop a competitive advantage. And there are a few options of cutting weeds with knives in crops we're looking at. So how do robot-assisted systems work? So we know that some crops are particularly susceptible to yield loss from weeds or from crop damage. So we know, for example, that onions are particularly susceptible to competition from weeds. And therefore we need to think very carefully about how close we get to an onion and how much damage we can afford to do around it. And various test rigs have been designed. These ones are both quite interesting in that they are energy self-sustaining, as in they've got solar panels, so hopefully if we, number two, perhaps we are on fire this time. Don't feel too hot, but I'm going to try and talk over it. So with some they can keep working, and some of them work on kind of punch systems out. Interestingly, in Germany, Bosch have got a system where they literally slide in different units, and this is on a startup company, and they can slide in different detection systems or different control mechanisms. So that could be that they have a punch mechanism that just really quickly fires in, sees where the weed is and go bang and sort it out, to maybe putting a time down at the point where you want it. And therefore, by having a rig where you can slot different systems in, you can have different analysis and different control techniques. So it is coming, and it's interesting that something like Bosch and places like Wageningen in Holland are really developing these systems and are working, they're working out there. With all these systems, we know that control is always better when weeds are smaller, because it's always easier to kill something smaller than to kill something that's better anchored into the soil or has more chance of recovery post-weeding. So the opportunities and excitement of having intelligent weed control, something that can go along, detect the difference of weed between the crop, is really exciting, because it means that we can be running during many more hours of the day. Even with these, you can have light sources underneath, and these are quite interesting because they take out some of the shadow or work in the shadow, so that you've got consistent light, because otherwise it's quite challenging where in bright sunlight you can see things quite differently to in shade situations. So light and angle of sun is really, you can see the shadow there, and it's really important to think of that in detection systems. They are easier to implement in practice than getting people out in the field. You know, we don't know what the post-Brexit scenario is, labour force-wise, and if we can have machines where we have more people just managing machines rather than people out there doing it. Less risk of crop injury, because they need to clearly differentiate the weed from the plant, but they can do that more accurately than a person with a hoe, and we all know that that causes, or the old-fashioned steerage hose on the back, which you only need to have a little wandering thought and you wandered down a row and took a section out. Not that I've ever done that myself, of course. There's more flexibility in time, and you can potentially get on and send something like this out 2 or 3 times. It depends how you're going to control the weeds. If you're dragging tines all the way through the soil, I wouldn't want to be running multiple times for mechanical weed control. One, you'll end up with an adaptation like Chloe was talking about. And secondly, it's just not good in terms of soil disturbance and releasing carbon from soils. So if you can have something that's very, very site-specific and doesn't stimulate the next round of weeds germinating, because that's a big problem with this, you go through and potentially you stimulate a whole new set of weeds to grow within your crop. So it needs to work in direct sown crops as well as transplant crops. And the problem we know with direct sown crops is that we have less regular spacing. They're more prone to, natural germination and things like that. And you can program these to say, right, I want a lettuce every 22 centimetres, therefore I'll take out all my lettuce seedlings between that space to make sure you've got your target plant population. So there's different ways. You can either work on pattern recognition or you can work on desired plant spacings and working to the maximum within that. So quite interesting options, especially as we struggle with some crops for achieving successful establishment due to pest competition. So looking at tractors and how we work these systems on the back, there's various approaches you can take. You can either have steerage on the machine itself on semi-mounted, and they kind of shift around here. You can have a line bar behind the tractor which shifts, and that's how a lot of the robo-crops work, so they just shift to follow the rows. Or you can have the tractor steerage in itself shifting, so different ways of operating. But really important that they require guidance systems. It's best if you start with a guidance system when planting your crop, be that lettuces or wheat or whatever else you're sowing, so that you can start off straight to make sure that you can carry on working easier. You need to have selective control valves to allow precision steering of implements to be able to get that level of accuracy. And you need to have multiple signals and multiple ways of making the correction to make sure you're as accurate as possible. You can't do it off one simple system because you need to be so close to get the control tight enough. So looking at the kind of patterns and weed recognition you've got, if you take an image like that, you can put it into a weed map and start to recognise out rows of crops versus where weeds are between the rows. And you can also look at things like thermal detection, that the plant has a different thermal image, the crop has a different thermal image to the weeds, and potentially use that as recognition. You could work on different refractance levels of light through, and build up a map of where you want to control and do your weed control within that. But I think the thing is, commercially at the moment, it's very difficult to know what you need to buy, and you go out to the market and there's always someone there prepared to sell you anything. If I said I needed a new car, someone would tell me I need every gadget in the car and I need to suddenly spend 25,000, where all I need is something to get me to and from work or whatever else, and hopefully I'm a salesman's nightmare. And I think it's really important when farmers take on these systems that we need to work out what we can get for free and how that relates to what we can subscribe and pay to get. And there's Sentinel satellite services that are for free that we can subscribe to, or there's other satellite images that we can pay for, or we can pay for full analysis to get this. And looking through, this is, and basically on the final element of that, saying to get 80% accuracy is relatively easy. To get that last 20% of accuracy is really, really hard and potentially really expensive, and is it worthwhile? And you've got to go out there and check everything's going right. So this is some data from Axeface. This is a field situation. They went out and took the satellite imagery, noticed out there this wild oat patch, and they're actually managing to map by using different reflectance levels off the crop, and they're getting wild oat mapping. I've seen other people do it with black grass, It's really easy to do with blackgrass when it's in here, but much harder to do earlier, and it's getting that earlier and earlier. And I've got a project with Bath University at the Royal Agriculture where we set up frames with cameras on them, and they're taking images all the time to understand how weeds emerge over time and getting the quickest diagnostics of leaf patterns, how colour. We know that weeds change in colour as they go through. They change when they're stressed in the winter, nutrient stress, temperature stress, and then how that changes. And so by building up an image of how the crop grows and making deep learning to understand how we can then use that for control. We have to remember that when we're doing all this surface weed control, we're always looking on the surface, and we have little idea of where the roots are, and that can affect how well we have control. And they're future things that hopefully we can get some better understanding of. Interestingly, now there's mechanical harvesters for white asparagus that can detect the white asparagus under the ground and just go in and dig it out. And therefore, if we can start understanding where the roots of our plants are, it makes a better system for control than just going in on that. So, yeah, different ways of killing the plant. It doesn't have to be chemical. It could be electrocution, so we've got electric weeding. Could be laser cutting. It could just be cutting. Could be mechanical damage. We could just punch it down into the ground, or we could blow the weed out potentially. And all these are different options, and they might suit different weeds. And as Chloe said, different solutions, but at different times to make it work. But many of these at the moment require hyperspectral cameras, which are super expensive. And we've got hyperspectral cameras out on here, down to 1 millimetre squared, to really detect the difference there. So they're expensive. So just to conclude, systems can be designed around weed control. That's the first important thing to do. You have to think about row widths and the technology. Weed and crop size are important, and the more precise you are, the more expensive it is, and different solutions that we take out there. So I just want to say we've got a couple of opportunities coming up at the RAU if anyone's interested, of funded MRes and PhDs. Adverts will be coming out this month if you know of anyone interested in those opportunities. Thank you.